measure of progress and well-being. Second of all, we want to showcase a diverse range of existing and emerging metrics that better capture social, environmental, and ethical dimensions of development. And lastly, to motivate our participants to advocate for policy shift and practical initiatives that prioritize holistic development. So let's welcome our panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe I'll start with Charlie and then we go all the way here to Nicole. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm Charlie Zong. I'm here as a representative of the Major Group on Children and Youth, which is the official youth constituency of the United Nations. I am also co-director of South North Scholars, which is a youth-led knowledge network that works with UN agencies on advancing perspectives that have been historically underrepresented in global discourses around human flourishing, including the topic of how do we measure human flourishing. And that leads us to this topic today about inclusive development.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cara Borja-Culina. I am the United Nations Youth Delegate to Malta, and I would like to thank you for extending your invitation. And I'm very excited for this discussion and to hear all of your contributions and insights. So let's get the show on the road. Thank you.
Lovely. Alan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alan Darmawan. I'm from Indonesia. I'm currently working at the Advisory Council to the President as personal assistant to the advisor to the President. I'm here representing the council as well as representing the Buddhist Jitsi Foundation, as I am part of their youth leadership program. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the program, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Corman da Silva. I'm Junior Policy Analyst at Zoe Institute for Future Fit Economies. Zoe is a think tank based in Europe, and as the name hints, we are working towards building economies that are fit for the future. So this means building economies that actually work towards people and the planet, and also their long-term needs. And part of our work then is like redefining what prosperity means and progress, and so I'm very excited to discuss today a bit more on how we can move towards beyond GDP. So thank you very much for organizing this event.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for all the introductions. It's clear that we actually have a wealth of experience and perspective today. We have someone from the major group, we have from the permanent missions coming from developed countries and developing countries, and we also have the subject expert. So I thank you for being here with us. As we gather today to explore metrics beyond GDP, we're reminded of a deeper question. Can the tool we use to measure progress, rooted in an era of material growth, and truly guide us towards a holistic well-being in the face of environmental degradation, inequality, and the erosions of human dignity? This session challenged us to reimagine a world where economic, social, and environmental dimensions are harmonized, where prosperity is defined by human well-being, compassion, and shared responsibility. How do we ensure our visions of progress encompass the well-being of people and the planet? So we understand that the limitations of traditional economic methods models are very clear. To truly thrive, we must prioritize measures that reflects the value of community, connections, environmental stewardships. This gathering is a crucial step in the direction that an opportunity for us to shape a future where progress is measured not just by economic output, but by flourishing all our life. So I would like to start off with questions to Alan. We've been discussing limitations of GDP as a comprehensive measure of progress. From your perspective as an Indonesian youth who also serve as the advisor to the president, how do you think GDP limits a nation's ability to describe progress, especially in emerging economies like Indonesia?
Thank you for the question, Hui. So Indonesia as a developing country has been relying so much on the GDP to measure its national progress. But as we all know, like GDP is a purely based on economic indicator. So it cannot really measure, it often overlooks like multi-dimensional nature of progress. It overlooks income inequality. It overlooks environmental health, social well-being, and many other factors. So like for countries, developing countries like Indonesia, we have been developing so much in terms of economic, but in the consequences, we are facing a lot of environmental problems, environmental degradation, such as deforestation and increasing carbon emission. And these cannot be measured by GDP. So yeah, we are facing like these problems. And so that's why it's very important to think beyond GDP to provide like a more holistic view on development. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for help us kickstart this conversation. Nicole, shifting gears slightly. So the Zoe Institute focuses on well-being policies, right? From your experience, what dimensions of human development and sustainability does GDP fail to measure? How do alternative metrics reshape the way we perceive true prosperity? Over to you.
Thank you also for the question.
Mhm.
And building a bit on what Alan said. So to start in a broader level, GDP fails to provide or to account for this very complex interplay between our economic system, our societal structures, and our natural environment. And this wrongly assumption of like the economy not being mapped into these two systems, but kind of forming this hierarchical structure has a series of consequences, some that you already touched upon, Alan. So like on the social side, it fails to consider equity issues. It also fails to consider on how we actually meeting our basic needs from a material side of well-being, like access to clean water, clean air, but also a non-material side. So subjective well-being, sense of belonging or lack of sense of belonging, sense of community, and a more inner side of well-being, if you like spirituality. It also fails to account for how our supply of labor is structured. So like how this is very based on unpaid care work, which historically is provided by women, historically invisible for GDP, because it does not follows a market logic. It doesn't follow a monetary transaction. So therefore, outside of GDP. On the environmental side, it's similar to ecosystem service. So like the service provided by nature, like carbon sequestration by forests. They also don't follow a market logic. It's not easy to put a price on this, and therefore invisible to GDP. Long-term effects of our production system, like climate change, pollution, and so on, that were already mentioned. And yeah, so it's like this missing understanding of like how actually economy is dependent on our social nature and to account for their limits. And to come to your second question and like how metrics can play a role, I think one of the first questions that comes to mind when we're thinking about metrics is like, what metrics of what do we want to measure? And that question kind of brings us one step back and allow us to think about like what actually matters, what is that we want to progress towards, what are goals in the end, and allow us to then start redefining how we see progress and prosperity.
I totally appreciate this perspective that you have. It's a bird's eye view and then as tunnel, as narrow as possible. So thank you both for actually helping us to highlight the critical dimension that GDP overlooks, especially from human development and sustainability. The phrase, what gets measured gets managed, resonates through policy circles. Yet when GDP becomes synonymous with progress, what critical elements such as social well-being, environmental health, or gender equity are lost in the narrow focus? So the consequences to this narrow focus are particularly concerning for generation inheriting our world. I'll turn it to Kara. As Malta's youth delegates, how do you see youth population being impacted by GDP's narrow focus on growth? Does it undermine the pursuit of more equitable and suitable sustainable future for younger generations?
So I believe that, GDP, it's very useful for measuring, economic growth. But as we said, it fails to capture the comprehensive well-being of societies at large. And especially when you consider the challenges that particularly youth face for the younger generations. We know that youth are becoming increasingly aware about economic growth as represented by GDP, but we know that this doesn't translate directly into equitable development for environmental sustainability, as you've already mentioned, both which are very critical to our future and our society now and in the future. So the narrow focus on GDP as a metric for national success, it disregards the social, environmental dimensions and even the cultural ones as well. And these are very much essential for any society. And we know that young people, they prioritize economic output, yes, but this being paired with quality of life, mental health, long-term visions, and wanting more social structures that support ecological systems, because we inherit these from past generations. And so a single-minded pursuit of GDP growth can lead to depletion of natural resources, as you mentioned, with environmental degradation, climate change, which disproportionately affect younger people and marginalized and vulnerable communities as well. So the consequences of environmental neglect with rising sea levels, etc., these intensify, and Malta, particularly as a small island nation, is even more susceptible to these matters, which continues to emphasize the inadequacy of the GDP framework as it stands today, especially for the younger generation. And secondly, also GDP doesn't account for income inequality. You mentioned with unpaid labor care, and the disparity sort of in wealth distribution are major concerns for young people today. And so while the GDP may indicate an overall increase in economic success, it might not directly translate into improved standards of living for young people on the ground as it stands in reality, because there's no equitable sharing over there. And even though the GDP might increase, wages might still stagnate. So there's not that accurate reflection over there as well. So we have that illusion of prosperity that is a result of it. And basically with young people in Malta and in the EU, particularly with regards to limited housing opportunities, limited employment opportunities, lack of affordability in all the senses, GDP doesn't account for these very precisely as on the ground as we would want it. So a GDP-focused model has to move beyond the short-term goals and embrace more of a long-term vision instead, to balance the economic, social, and cultural aspects that I mentioned, so we can create a fairer and more inclusive world, essentially, with more long-term investments, reducing inequalities, and so at the end of the day, just to sum up what I've mentioned, it does remain insufficient. That is why we're here discussing beyond GDP. So we must incorporate all different factors, so it will be cross-cutting. And what other generation than the younger generation to include these innovative solutions to it? So we have to look at young people as, rather than passive recipients, as active participants in mobilizing this change, to understand that GDP alone is inadequate and that the change is needed. So
Yeah. Thank you so much for highlighting the limitations that we have here. And also realizing that how many of us here, maybe back home, are considered as urban poor. And many of you who can't even have the privilege to be here participating in conversation like this, right? So let's hear from Charlie. From your experience working with youth in developing countries through South North Scholars, what governance framework do they believe should be adopted to ensure the transition beyond GDP results in equitable access to resources, educations, and opportunities for all?
Thanks, Hui. And I really appreciate the point that you just made about all the people that are, in a broader sense, with us in this space, that they may not be here, they may not be in New York for UN General Assembly Week, but they are absolutely here with us. I think that when we think about governance frameworks, perhaps because of where we are right now in the context of the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future, where there are high-level conversations happening, I think there can be this temptation to think at a very abstract level. And it's why I really appreciate, Kara, what you just said about how there are on-the-ground realities that in some sense, you have to be there to understand. And that's why I'm really grateful for everyone who's here with us online. In terms of a governance framework, I noticed that one of the themes of this event was about a particular part of the Pact for the Future. So the Pact for the Future is a consensus document that is being negotiated by UN member states to try to chart a path forward to deliver the agenda on sustainable development goals by 2030. And in that pact, there is an action called Action 54, which is pushing for a new way of measuring human progress that goes beyond GDP. I think it particularly mentions GDP. I want to talk about some of the efforts that the UN has made in the past couple of decades to try to propose a new governance framework. And I bring this up because in the course of our work in South North Scholars, as well as the conversations we have with the major group, we found that these efforts really do have resonance with young people in developing contexts around the world. The effort that I'm talking about is called the Human Development Approach, and in particular, the Human Development Index, which currently stands as the most significant effort by the United Nations and, in a sense, by the development community to go beyond GDP. And it's really not a very complicated metric. In a lot of ways, it could be expanded, for example, to count more for environmental issues. But it actually, in a way, it works in that policymakers look at it. And I think that means that we could actually reframe this conversation a little bit and ask, what does GDP do right? Like, what is it about GDP that makes it so sticky as a metric that people keep looking at it? Policymakers pay attention to it, even though they have information about its limits. And I think what it does right is that it provides a very clear incentive structure that's based on a number. And for better or worse, people who are making high stakes decisions, they need clear metrics. As you mentioned, what gets measured makes progress. So when we think about how can we go beyond GDP, how can we develop more holistic measures, how can we develop better governance frameworks, I think we want to really remember that it's not actually metrics or policy or technology that creates solutions or that moves humanity forward, it's people. And for that, the governance framework that young people around the world have told us about through the work we do with the UN and South North Scholars has really focused on two things. One is to think about this concept of agency. So really, we're here talking about what we think a different kind of metric of human progress would look like. But there are lots of other people, both in this space with us, as well as in communities around the world. And really, they have the knowledge about what flourishing means to them and what deprivations they're facing. So agency, this central principle that people around the world have a meaningful say in co-creating solutions in their local context, that's really important as a part of a framework. The second point that young people consistently tell us about is access as a principle. So being in this space right now requires an internet connection. It requires us to be here. And for a lot of young people, that's not something that they can take for granted. So really embracing a governance framework that emphasizes creating spaces that are accessible and building the infrastructure of access like digitalization and digital literacy is going to be transformational for governance frameworks. I also kind of wanted to point out a couple of specific points to bring this a little more down to the concrete level. The major group has been proposing significant and we would say successful inputs to drafts of the Pact for the Future as the primary document explaining the global agenda on the SDGs. And one of them is really to put more young people onto decision-making boards and into decision-making processes, even going beyond just specific metrics or specific asks, just putting young people into those rooms and creating those accessible spaces, letting the young people speak for themselves, so that although we have a lot of expertise, we don't always speak for them. That's an example in Action 49, which is about governance of development banks and other institutions. We propose that input. On a slightly broader level, I wonder if this resonates with any of us. The concept of a 21st century architecture for international cooperation on global public goods like climate action or public health, that is going to be an extremely important governance framework to take into account the reality that holistic human flourishing requires resources and it requires cooperation. So these are still not very specific policy recommendations, but they're examples of the kinds of governance frameworks that resonate for young people in developing countries. And I think that if we focus not just on metrics and not just on going beyond GDP, but asking ourselves, what does it take for anything like GDP to turn into action? That's going to result in a much richer conversation. And I'm so excited to be able to have that conversation with you.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. And speaking about actions, actually, we are actually having a questions for Nicole, because this actually lies at the heart of Merge Project's work as well. To shed light on how we might answer to them, let's hear from Nicole. Could you share insights from Merge on how emerging well-being centered metrics provide a fuller picture of societal progress? And how can these new metrics gain tractions in national and international policy making?
Sure, thanks. Maybe I would first share a few words on Merge Project, just to present quickly to the peers here and to the people online. So the Merge Project is a EU-funded project that brings together 16 different organizations, from academic institutions to think tanks like Zoe Institute, to civil society organizations and policy practitioners, all who are working on beyond GDP topics and alternative metrics and policy frameworks. It really aims to foster easy to use, accessible metrics to be implemented in governance processes. And it makes this connection of science policy interface to try to promote dialogue, co-creation, and also knowledge exchange. The project started this year, but there was already some learnings on how, or like some levers of change, what is important for metrics to actually be effectively and positively impacting the way we make policy and make decisions. The first learning is that changes in the technical infrastructure, and I think here I echo a bit what Charlie said, they need to be accompanied by changes on the governance level. So metrics needs to be applied. And this means that we need to bring them to the way we're making policies. For instance, you could have well-being metrics used actually to take budgetary decisions and to assess how investment is actually contributing towards building better living standards and so on. And here I want to emphasize that it needs to be a holistic integration of these metrics into the policy cycle. So for instance, to mention the case of the SDGs in the EU, which is what I'm a bit more familiar with. Although the SDGs are very much in the discourse and some policy frameworks do mention them, they're usually used as a monitoring tool. So in the very end of the policy cycle, when things were already developed, chosen, and then they are just producing reports on how we are moving or how we are performing against the SDGs, but they are not holistic used as a core concept on thinking policies in the first place, on designing these frameworks, on taking decisions and choosing policy options. The second point, or the second learning, is that we need dialogue between this technical or the technical work and the policymakers. So we need to facilitate conversations between those working on ensuring data quality, understanding the methodologies behind new metrics, and those who use this metric in the end. So they also can share what are their needs and understand better the limitations of current data and so on. And the third point, and again, echoing a bit what Charlie said, it's the need to build some consensus around it. So like Merge Project really comes from the idea that we need that there is a lot of good work already done on how to move beyond GDP, on alternative metrics. You mentioned the Human Development Index. There is this work didn't start not even in this century. It started already before. The UN has the Brundtland Report defining sustainable development and so on. But what we need is to seek convergence and to really like come together and start thinking how we can build a shared understanding around this and how to build a shared vision towards like what we want to achieve. This is also looking back on how GDP is so successful, right? So like historically, international organizations like the UN played a very important role on like mainstream GDP across countries. And that's why it's exciting that the Pact for the Future that will be discussed and hopefully agreed on in the Summit of the Future coming up now does have a mention to like moving beyond GDP and starting a task force on like discussions on how we can actually build the infrastructure and pave the governance structures around the world to implement that. So yeah, I think that are 3 points. We also, and I agree very much on the need for like this new metrics and these new ideas to be democratically legitimized. So we need participatory process also and throughout the whole process. And this way kind of find a like sweet spot between having universal concepts and ideas, but also that can be contextualized to different communities, different countries, different understandings of like what well-being or beyond GDP might mean.
Wow. Thank you so much. I'm enjoying the panel so much, and I find that this is a lot of alignment on tailoring the matrices. Let me move on to Alan. So I understand that what metrics beyond GDP should be emphasized to track the intersections of sustainable development and energy policy with your background. Yeah.
As Indonesia is moving towards energy transition, as we know that we are actually trying to relocate our capital city to the new capital city is called Nusantara. It's located in the island of Borneo. In the geographically, it's in the middle central of Indonesia, and the government actually hopes for the new capital city to be powered fully by renewable energy, by green energy. Going back to the beyond GDP concept, GDP cannot really measure a country's readiness to move toward just transition. So there are other like metrics. One of them would be Energy Transition Index. This is developed by the World Economic Forum. It measures a country's readiness to perform a just transition. It measures like energy security, energy access, and so on. So there are actually, I agree with what Charlie said, that a metrics, it should be targeted on what we want to achieve. And I also like what he said about giving youth the opportunity to be decision makers. Because for us in the developing countries, sometimes we young people, we have lots of ideas, but we just don't have the platform to channel those ideas and or even to speak out those ideas and to make them into realizations. So if I may propose something, I think it would be nice to have like a youth development index developed by youth to measure the development of youth, because we are like Indonesia, we have this program called Golden Indonesia 2045, where we are hoping to be to have an increase in economy and in many aspects, because 2045 would be our 100th anniversary of our independence. And right now we are actually enjoying our demographic bonus. Demographic bonus meaning that we have more young people productive in their productive age compared to other age groups. So this is a really great potential for us, and this is a great time for us to ensure that youth are given the space to really do something. And I believe that many countries, not only Indonesia, they are enjoying this demographic bonus. And it would be nice to have like a index to measure and to ensure that youth are developing towards the right direction, towards promoting sustainable development in line with sustainable development goals, because we are the actors and we would be the leaders in the future who will decide on policy. Yeah, and again, moving to the your question about energy policy, another index would be environmental safety index. It is used to measure that all actions taken are not giving like bad consequences to the environment. Yeah. I think those metrics are important to ensure that developing countries move toward the right direction in terms of just energy transition.
Thank you so much, Alan. You reminded me of the projects of Nusantara. Back in 2018, during the World Urban Forum, we see similar examples when they're showcasing Catalonia on how they can do the urbanizations. And just about 2 days ago, when I was at the UN, I heard about things like Youth 2030 cities, having youth participating in urbanization, community planning, how they can implement, say, for example, community garden and increase the engagement for up to 25% based on the area they are living in. So things like that, I believe they are totally exist, but it's just a matter of how do we know they're accessible to youth and large, and then how they are being publicized or how being marketed in a way. Yeah, thank you so much. So let's move on to Kara. Kara, what role do youth play in demanding equitable governance model, and how can their voices be institutionalized in the transition away from GDP-driven frameworks?
Okay, so we know that youth play a critical role in ensuring equitable governance models, and this can be through many different facets, because youth nowadays are both present and future stewards of society. And so the global challenges we face are very complicated, but we need to overcome them to create governance structures which are inclusive, fair, and equitable. And so this brings us to the fact that we have to move towards more holistic development models. And so in doing so, we have to focus a lot on youth advocacy, in the sense that since GDP goes beyond the economic indicators that we already mentioned, youth have already been mobilizers in this sense through climate justice campaigns, for example, Fridays for Future, for example. And it shows that economic growth can't come at the expense of environmental sustainability. So the short-term economic gains compared to the long-term well-being of our society cannot be prioritized in that sense. And so to create the social and environmental foundations should remain our priority and is the priority for the younger generation. And to ensure that there is the strengthening and preservation of these foundations. But advocacy is only one element of youth involvement. We have to move beyond in the sense that you mentioned with the institutionalization, with the GDP driven frameworks and beyond, so we can ensure the meaningful engagement of young people in all forms of decision-making processes, especially the formal ones. And so a lot of governance structures lack, unfortunately, the mechanisms for youth participation, which is consistent and meaningful at the end of the day. And so it has to go beyond the symbolic representation and tokenism. And this can be through different platforms, including informal channels, temporary consultations, through youth advisory forums, youth panels, youth boards. And so this can ensure that young people are influencing policy in a way which is impactful, which is sustained, and which is sustainable. And so the institutionalization of these platforms very much requires the establishment of, apart from temporary consultations, permanent platforms as well, to ensure that young people can contribute and participate at the local, national, and international on those levels and spheres. And this can be seen also through the delegate programs, the United Nations Youth Delegate programs, where young people from all across the world are given a seat at the table, and that the table is being expanded to add more seats to ensure and to display the fact that youth and young persons are not homogeneous, that we're represented in all of our diversity. And so the creation of these formal pathways to really ensure that the input of young people is being given the recognition and integration and incorporation that it deserves is very, very important. So as Nicole had mentioned, the creation of the participatory structures factors to influence policy outcomes. The fact that youth quotas are in legislative processes, as well, with the voting ages being reduced. For example, in Malta, Austria, we can vote at age 16. The participatory budgeting processes as well that prioritize youth-driven projects to be able to empower young people, for them to also move beyond GDP, and as well educational initiatives, which are the stronghold of all of we're discussing, to empower young people to be able to think critically as to what is GDP, what are its shortcomings, how can we improve and move beyond it, so that through civic education and political literacy we can move beyond. And I really liked what Charlie had mentioned as well with regards to the HDI. I just wanted to provide a little bit of an explanation with regards to it, being it is a composite measure, and it's developed by the UN, as you mentioned, to evaluate the social and economic development of different countries by using these different dimensions, so life expectancy, education, and the standard of living. And so it ranks countries on a scale from 0 to 1, with the higher values being equated to the higher levels of human development. And as an alternative to GDP, we also have the genuine progress indicator, which accounts for the environmental and social factors, which we mentioned, which are so important, like the unpaid work and its value, the income inequality, the environmental degradation, and also deducts the costs associated with crime, pollution, and loss of natural resources. So by including different key stakeholders in the implementation of these models, we can ensure that climate change, inequality in all its senses, digital innovation, we can all take them into account in crafting governance models which are truly reflective of what we're discussing and ultimately move beyond the traditional conventional GDP measures and metrics.
Thank you so much. I love the views that you can cover throughout everything. Speaking about the energy or the participations that we could see here, I'm really looking forward to the participations or the Summit of the Future, just like what we experienced maybe months ago during the ECOSOC Youth Forum, and comparing to the situations where we experienced during the high-level political forum. The amount of participation we see youth getting involved is totally different. Also, another thing is, as much as possible, being the civil society organizations or any stakeholders right here really do encourage us to take the time, take an extra effort to have the conversation and get the youth involved or expand the platform, let them be here. Just like during high-level political forum too, we had a dialogue on regional youth decision-making processes, how we can have that being included. And I would say for civil society organization like us, it's really stepping out of our comfort zone to discuss topic like this. Okay, I want to turn it back to Charlie. 1 second. Where's my questions for Charlie? Okay. Charlie, I know that you bring very unique perspective on the life experience of young people navigating a world shaped by the GDP-centric policies. So as a founder of Global Youth Network focused on sustainable development, how have you seen limitations of GDP-based policies play out in terms of addressing issues such as inequalities, access to education, and climate actions in developing countries? And what alternative approaches have you and the young leaders in your network identified that better capture the concern of youth in this region? I know you shared some of the examples earlier, but can you walk us through a little bit more on this?
Certainly. And I'm just taking in everything that has been shared by our panelists, just truly holistic viewpoints, which we need more of. I think we can think about youth holistically too. I recently had a conversation with the youth minister of one of the, it was a youth minister, I am trying not to misrepresent his title, but in charge of youth policy for one of the UN member states in the Pacific region, which is a region that is not often represented in discussions, but which has a really rich history of holistic perspectives on sustainable development. And he made a point to me that young people are not just a group, but they're also a stage. That we were all young once. Some of us stay young in some senses, but I think what he meant was that, in a way, young people bring something that goes beyond just having a certain set of needs, and even goes beyond having a certain set of experiences, but rather that youth as a stage that we all go through has an impact on everyone, that inside every person is a set of experiences about what it means to be young. And in particular, that set of experiences, I think, can be broken down into a couple of specific features that I think a focus on GDP and in some sense a focus on all metrics might leave out of the conversation. And those features are the way that young people make sense of the world through stories, stories about their personal experiences, stories about the challenges that they face. In a sense, young people, especially those who are still in early stages of education, they don't as much try to fit their experiences into specialized frameworks or to, for example, disciplinary frameworks. And instead, they think about just the holistic experience that they have as members of a community that are developing. And those stories that combine the different challenges that they face simultaneously, I think, a really powerful way for us to make sense of the challenges we face that go beyond not just GDP, but really goes beyond metrics. It reasserts the importance of embodied knowledge that young people have in all regions. But in order for these stories to emerge, there have to be spaces for young people to get together and share their perspectives with people of all generations who were all young once. And those spaces take on various forms. And Kara pointed out a lot of specific forms that I think are worth pursuing, ranging from permanent platforms to board positions to really just more spaces in civil society and in media and at places like the UN for young people to share their stories. I want to touch on a specific example of how this kind of space can allow stories to become solutions. And it's a project that South North Scholars did with the UN Development Program, specifically with the Human Development Report Office, which is in charge of the Human Development Index and other indices. It's called Solving for Humanity, and it was the largest youth-led innovation challenge, bringing together over 3,000 young people. And instead of asking young people to tell us about the problems and the metrics, we actually asked them to start with, what is your dream of what development looks like? What does inclusive and sustainable development look like to you? What does human development look like to you? We asked them to talk about their dreams, and only then to talk about the obstacles in the context of those dreams. And so we took metrics totally out of the picture and just had them share their stories and then analyze the obstacles. And in that way, come up with solutions that were really unique to their local context. We were able to have young people from indigenous communities in India and from refugee settlements in Tanzania who were talking to us about really intergenerational, intersectional solutions. We had a team of young people from an indigenous community in the Amazon who were talking to us and who had teamed up with people who were graduate students to talk about the need for preservation of indigenous construction techniques in building sustainable structures. And that's not something that I think anyone sitting at a desk anywhere would have thought of. But it's exactly the kind of embodied knowledge that I think makes spaces so important. And is why I so much appreciate, Kara, what you mentioned about the different kinds of spaces. I do think that metrics are important. I think there's a reason why GDP has been so influential. There's a reason why the Human Development Index has been so influential. And as you mentioned, it is kind of, it could be made more holistic, but it's influential in part because it takes a very complicated problem of development and it provides a clear way to measure it. So when we think about metrics and how we can make better metrics, I would encourage us to think about, to start from the point of stories and to start from the point of dreams and start from recognizing that there are different ways to think about youth. And one of the ways to think about youth is that youth is not just about not having agency or not being in platforms. Youth is about having grand dreams, and it's about having stories. And in that sense, we're all young. I think we can all, if we start from the perspective of stories and work backward to think about problems and then to think about solutions and then to think about metrics, that's how we're going to get more meaningful metrics.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. I really agree with what you have visualized for us here. And I also can see that lately in the trends of civil society organizations or youth-led organization, we see things like action and practice, advocacy project, action and practice. These are the things that we try to break down all this possibility into actionable item, a short-term commitment for people to actually be involved in the development of their community, of their country. And you mentioned about going back to the region, because how many of us can just fly all the way, one day flights to come all the way here to the UN to have experiences like this? So I also agree with what Alan said before, and many of us here. You find a platform, find a space where you can get involved more. And I can compare the experiences that we have, say, example, in UNSCAP, and I have here. Clearly, you see the participations, the amount of interaction, the engagement that you can take home, and the quality connections that you can have is totally so different compared to you come to the UNHQ with a sea of people, you can't even find your friends. Or for example, like your previous experiences going to COP, maybe you take first 2 days to figure out ways to find a pavilion, then you start working yourself out. So thank you so much for the inputs that you have. I really enjoyed the panel. Is there anything else that you would like to build on or add on? Any one of you? No? Okay, if not, let me guess our friends online and our friends here. Do you have any questions that you want to direct to any of our panelists? Anyone? I don't know, Jade, Phyllis, you?
I do wonder about, from Charlie's point of view, how do you think about let's put it in an index where let's say the GDP apart, and how do we use the new in general, like under some specific way for them to take some action?
Thank you, Jade.
I think I've shared a lot, so I'll try to be brief. On a tactical level, how do young people get into these spaces? How do they find partners to work with? I think it's about thinking about problems as much as possible from a human perspective. So for example, we're here at Some of the Future, and young people around the world are in their communities. And we can think about the problems we face in terms of policies, technologies, really large metrics, but we also think about who has the power to solve these problems or put resources towards solutions. And it's usually specific people in specific positions. And that's true of the UN as well, in the sense that the UN is a very large institution. I'll use the UN as an example. But the UN is a very big institution. And so a lot of times we work with a lot of young people in developing communities who say, I want to work with the UN on a solution. And the thing I always tell them is that it's more important to find a friend inside an institution than it is to think about the institution as such. So when we're at these forums or in your communities around the world, it's effective. It's an effective use of time to build some relationships with people who have expertise or who have decision-making power, and think about who your friend is in an institution who is willing to respect you, take you seriously, take into account your knowledge, your ideas. It's usually a specific person. We can't be friends with metrics or institutions, but we can be friends with people. So I think finding your friend is the first step.
Thank you.
I really liked what you mentioned, and it really reminded me of the value of mentorship programs in young people with our agency and with our own expertise. We have the ability to discuss topics which aren't only youth-centered or youth-oriented, but other topics that move beyond that realm. But establishing this and acknowledging this, we also recognize the fact that with years comes life experience, and with life experience that is lacking at a younger age. So looking towards people who have more expertise, who are superiors in that sense, who have more knowledge to impart, I feel that the mentorship programs are very, very useful. As you said, finding a friend within an institution where there can be that transfer of knowledge as well, and that sense of continuity and consistency to be able to develop your skills and to gain more skills, and also maybe impart your knowledge onto someone else and enable them to develop new skills. So I feel as though that intergenerational approach cannot be undermined in that sense.
And
Can I
Helen?
add on something?
Yes, please.
One of my motivations coming to this kind of event is actually to make networks. Make networks with all generations, not only youth, but also the more senior decision makers. And I have felt the benefit of making networks, because having you coming to this kind of event, you don't know who you are going to meet on this day. Like today, I have learned so much from the panels, and I heard so many new, fresh ideas, and I'm really glad to be able to make these connections, because our meeting is not on doesn't end here. It will grow to a more perspective relations. It will grow to more opportunities in the future. And also one thing as well that is important to mention is we are very privileged to be here, to experience this, to build our connections. But we must not forget young people and others who cannot make it here. So the way we can also help them is, after we attend this kind of events, we have to return to our community, share our stories, share our experiences, and share the learnings that we have got here, so that it can be something impactful, not only to ourselves, but only to our community and to more young people. So they are also inspired to take action and to also look for different opportunities to do something. At least that's what with my own story. I was very inspired by many people around me. And before, I didn't have the opportunity to participate in this kind of international forum that much. And it just encouraged me to look for more opportunities. When I see like people around me, they can build connections, interesting connections, they can learn so much. So it gave me the energy inside of me to also try to do the same, to also go out there, tell what I have in my mind, and just build wider network. And
That's very powerful perspective. Do you want to add on, Nicole?
I can say a few words. I think Kara, Charlie, and Alan can speak with much more propriety on youth. But on the privilege of being here today, being in New York, I also think it's important that we remember with privilege, it comes responsibilities, right? So yeah, I think it's our responsibility to take then what is discussed here, what will be agreed in the summit, and bring to our communities, to our countries, and then really push for then the momentum after. Like the real work really starts after these commitments are made, right? We need to implement. And for sure, youth need to have this agency role and for change. And I think one other point that before the panel started, actually, I was talking with Kara about a bit like how sometimes these organizations, especially the UN, these international organizations, are like these big institutions that are very abstract. And I think what Charlie said about like, it's people behind that working, you have to have a friend there, and also to understand like how the process works, to start breaking it into more like concrete conversations on like what's actually going on and mystifying a bit what is behind the walls. And that also education on since young age can help a lot on this also. So like not necessarily like on how exactly the UN works, but like why should you care, why it's relevant, and get people interest on like these discussions from a young age.
Thank you, Nicole. Building on how to make it relevant, is it okay if I can invite Phyllis to share a little bit about your work in Malaysia? Because you do not know, people who are sitting here behind the camera, they're actually day in, day out, spending a whole year building the pieces of all the efforts during, say, the SDG development goals. So Phyllis, I would like to invite you to share your work on APPGM, and as well as being the head of the SDG agent for Malaysia. Then we invite our friends in front to share a little bit. Sure.
Hi everyone, this is Malaysia, representing the all-party parliamentary group Malaysia on SDGs, or AOE, but for short it's APPGM SDG. So APPGM is actually endorsed by the parliament in Malaysia to localize the SDGs in the 222 constituencies of Malaysia. And what we kind of do is we collaborate with the ministers, with the stakeholder organizations, and with the local communities. It happens through a process of basically 5. Number 1 is going on ground, identifying the issues that are happening in the local communities. Then you prioritize those issues, you thematize it, then you build the capacity of the local communities there, map out these issues with the ministers that are relevant to the constituencies. Then these ministers will select 3 of those issues that they want to prioritize. Once that is prioritized, the solutions are developed by the researchers to identify, and these solutions are mapped with the local organizations. Once the local organizations are ready to adopt those solutions, they are given minimum funding to implement those solutions. And this takes about a project within 3 months, which can be upscaled further. Once that is done, you have the impact evaluation process. And some of these issues, you can see that it is not just related to the local communities, but is more policy-related issues. So once that is addressed, then you bring it back up to interagency dialogue between the government, public sector, and the grassroots. Bring them together, talk about what are the policy-related issues that are going on, and how do we measure or analyze the impact. And then finally, you have the impact evaluation. What are the impacts that happens that once the project is implemented? How can this resolve the local context or individualized issues? But of course, I actually wanted to ask a question earlier on the quantitative and qualitative measures, because many of the work that we do at APPGM is very qualitative. So you have to do the research with the grassroots, and they are not on 2 numbers. They are actually, as you said earlier, on the stories that they share. And these are qualitative stories. How do you give it a numeric value? I think that's quite a difficult situation. So, however, one gap that I saw within our context, this is my personal view, so is that you have the measures of the progress of SDGs, but those are done by quantitative researchers that are measuring the numerical values of those progresses. But you do not have much of the qualitative experiences that are coming out, and these are not perhaps documented by many of these organizations. And these are local civil societies that are taking up those solutions. So how do you navigate between measuring a progress when we are talking about GDP and beyond? How do you measure or document it? And how do you present so that it gives a holistic perspective, not only in terms of its content, but in terms of its methodology? So yeah, I think I hope I kind of gave an understanding of what is going on in Malaysia. But yeah.
Any of our panelists would like to take the question?
I can try to give a start. I think it's a very key question, and I don't have a specific answer to that. I think it's a very valid point on this. Like, discussion on like, if we want to move beyond GDP, like, shouldn't we also like allow for other methodologies, other understandings that are not necessarily like this technical numerical language that is used? And I think the answer is yes. And I think that's then what we have to look for. Like, how do we then bring this into a way that, as I think was mentioned, like GDP or this metrics, they reduce complexity. They allow you to bring like diverse information into a number, but this comes with trade-offs, right? And you lose a lot in the way also. So like, how do you have this combination of the qualitative understanding also? It's also, you don't want to measure everything, both on more like people's experience, but also on nature, right? How do you put a price on or a number on everything? And maybe this is not exactly an answer to your question, but one approach that we try to use with Zoe Institute is really co-creation. So trying to bring people together to understand first problems in a more with different perspectives, and then a shared understanding of the problems, and then try to build up solutions. And I think this methodology can be also used to assess like how things are going, and then already provide like ideas on how to tackle what's not going well without having to go through like necessarily a number to then show that things are not going well. So maybe that's one possibility on how to start incorporating more qualitative views into how we measure exactly. But
First, I wanted to ask if other people have questions.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Emmanuel. I'm from Nigeria. All right. So, and it's a privilege to be in this session today. Just wanted to have a bit more on what Alan and Nico mentioned when you talked about the importance of going back to the grassroots level to discuss what we learn from this kind of conversations. And also for Nico, you talked about privilege and how it comes with a lot of responsibilities. I think it is very, very important that we note that there should be a kind of bidirectional. We should be bidirectional in our communication, because it's not enough to just come here and go back to the youth at the grassroots level to say, oh, this is what is happening, this is the discussion and all. They don't feel like they have a sense of belonging. So in order to create that sense of belonging, before we come to levels like this, we should engage the young people who are not privileged, like you and I here, before we come to see what is happening, what is going on. Let's see the world through their lens, because you are educated, I'm educated. We have the young ones who are not educated, and their views also matters too, because when we're talking about youth, they are also one of that. And this is a conversation that I just want to contribute. It was going to be a question that I was going to ask, but you responded to it by answering that. So I just wanted to harp on that we should also note that engaging with other youth within our building relationship, like Charlie mentioned, that collaborate, partnership. Let's build our relationship. We should establish that. And lastly, to just add to what your question, I think you're doing a very amazing job. And the nonprofit I work with is called Chess in Slums Africa. And we use the game of chess as a framework to empower children from marginalized background. When you talk about Africa, people look at poverty. They think about children, malnourished, but then we're trying to use chess as a means to challenge the single story of poverty, to show that there are greatness everywhere. Talent is universal, but opportunities are not. So we use chess as that framework to create that opportunity. And one thing we have done successfully well is that our story has really gone viral. Like we have been featured on almost major international news outlets, but we do not have the quantitative side to show our work. So just in June, I was in Belgium, where we're now trying to do a kind of research. Now, the research is a mixed methodology, is a mixed method where we're combining both quantitative data we have and then used the qualitative aspect, then add an ethnographic aspect to it to be able to tell our story beyond the qualitative narrative that is out there. So I can suggest that you can look at partnering with research institutions who are good that can help you extract, because within that qualitative story that is being shared, there are quantitative data that can be extracted. We can be brought out and then combined, just like we are talking about multi-stakeholder. It had to be multifaceted in doing that. So you can look at collaborating with research institution, maybe a university or a professor, to say, oh, please, this is what we're doing. Can you help us look at how we can get quantitative data to augment the qualitative story we have and be able to tell a compelling story? Thank you. We can talk more after the program. Thank you.
Thank you for the response. Yeah, I do agree that collaboration is very important. And the way we return to our community, there can be many creative ways to do it. One of them would be, I think, if we have like local chapters, like let's say this organization, this CC organization, they also have local chapters in Indonesia. They have local chapters in other countries. We can work with our own, first we can work with our own organizations, local chapters. We can reach out to our the community that is nearest to us first. And then another way would be we can collaborate with educational institutions, which I think is also very important. We can, so what I usually do is I would always try to find a way to reach out to my previous schools, like my previous high schools, my previous universities, because I already have the connection, and it would be easier to reach out to them, and they would, most of the time, they would be supportive of an alumni going back to the school to share something good to the students. So yeah, that's the first step. I think for me, one of the first thing that I would always do is to return to the community where I already have existing connections, where I'm already accustomed to. And also the second one would be, I like to write my experience, because by writing and sharing it in social media, we can reach a wider network. We can reach people who we have never met before. Yeah, I think by using this two method, we can reach both who have online accessibility and those who only has offline accessibility. Yeah, by reaching out to educational institutions. Thank you.
I don't have much to add. I echo a lot what Alan said. I think also, just to add, that I think this work also starts before, even really bringing awareness about the discussions that are happening, that this even before coming here, sharing, because this is a long-term process, right? This is the result of what's already being discussed and what's already going on. And then really understanding that it's like an ecosystem, and there is a lot of work in the community that is already advancing these topics. Maybe they use different terms, maybe they use different concepts, but it's then going to the community that and first asking what you're doing, how does this connect to you, and so on, and then together finding the synergies and how to build in one another. And then I also think that it's important here, now talking a bit about the UN because of the summit, but that they also, that these big organizations also are a bit more aware of what's already happening, because there is much happening on the community and local and regional level that it's not so connected. It feels like different bubbles sometimes. So it's important to bring this knowledge to communities, but it's also important to bring the knowledge from communities to here, right? And I think this we can also play a very big role
So much. Anyone would like to add on? Okay. Yes, please.
I just wanted to share a very concrete example of what it means to take a lot of qualitative data, engage with a quantitative metric, and get something done because you made a friend in an institution. I really appreciate both of these questions because I've said a lot about moving beyond metrics in general, thinking about stories, but it's true that metrics matter. And sometimes we do just have to work with the metrics that currently have the attention of people who have decision-making authority. Doesn't mean that they'll always have the authority or that those metrics always matter, but they do now. And it's really problem solving is about working with what we have now. And I was thinking about the findings, Zoe, that you mentioned earlier, the 3 findings. And it occurred to me that this is actually also, so metrics and governance, the relationship between those two, SDGs currently as a monitoring tool, but not being used holistically to decide priorities. So priorities is another finding. And the second, third findings about dialogue and consensus. It actually occurred to me that that's kind of a process of how do you move from metrics to action. In the case of South North Scholars, the way we got Solving for Humanity started was very strange. Actually, what happened was that we had a chance encounter with a senior leader from the UN. And at this point, I was a college student. And I had this thought that I think all young people have when we engage with people who have built up a lot of experience and networks, which is what could I possibly offer that's valuable? And I did something very radical in that moment, which is I admitted that I had no idea what I could offer that would be valuable, but I wanted to find out. So instead of coming to this senior leader with ideas about, hey, you should use this other metric, or you should, look at this story, I was thinking, well, what are they paying attention to? And what I did was I asked for a meeting between South North Scholars and this UN agency. And I said, I heard what you were saying about how you care about youth engagement. I think that that's really special to us. I think we can work together to advance your understanding of youth engagement. And he said, okay, let's meet. And so before that meeting, we did a lot of research. In this case, the agency was UNDP. We did a lot of research into the way that UNDP measures youth engagement. We didn't necessarily feel like these metrics captured everything, but we wanted to understand their metrics. And because we understood their metrics and we understood how it mattered to their governance, we then were able to come to them with a proposal where one of the things we did was we actually pulled up their metrics and we said, we think that this idea of a youth competition, an innovation challenge, could actually increase your engagement with young people in a meaningful way. We also had a slide where we actually mapped out different kinds of youth competitions to show that what we were trying to do didn't exist. So that's taking, a one-dimensional number into a two-dimensional plane, but it actually was a very visual way of showing that there's a missing opportunity here. And because we were able to engage with their metrics, even though, of course, all metrics could be improved, we were able to get some dialogue going. And because of that dialogue, to engage, we were basically engaging with technical experts, and we were young people. We were able to reach a consensus about what this competition would look like and how we would measure its success based on their metrics, as well as some ideas of our own. And that was how we managed to turn an idea from a bunch of college students into a global competition that has now helped to inform some of the flagship development reports that are read by policymakers. But I want to kind of add a fourth and final stage after dialogue and consensus. So after metrics, dialogue, and consensus, I want to add the stage that I think is really important, which is community. We have a little community going on here. I think there are many other communities, and really what communities are gatherings of friends. So the major group is an example. Those of us gathered in this space are an example. I also wanted to, because of Alan, what you mentioned about engaging with your educational institutions as a way of meeting people, I wanted to mention a program the UN does called the Millennium Fellowship. It's for undergraduates. And It is basically a space in each college campus where young people gather who are each building their own little community, their own little social project or social impact project, but they gather to share their findings and to engage with global efforts like the SDGs. I just wanted to put that out there as one resource you can look at if you're a college student. I'm an alumnus of that program. In a way, it gave me access to a community of like 10,000 young people around the world who care about local solutions to global problems. It's very transformational. So just to give you a concrete example of this process, how we got this huge competition started and the importance of support from a community and a specific community you can look into. So thanks for these questions.
And just to give last final remarks, taking on what was mentioned by all the panel speakers here, and the sense that you mentioned the bi-directional communication, especially with the roles of youth representatives and youth delegates who travel from their countries to attend certain conferences in a almost sporadic sense, in that their time at the UN is limited to a few weeks or a few months. And so immersing themselves to an intense degree, but then taking that knowledge and information back to the grassroots, back to their own countries, and finding a way to meaningfully integrate and incorporate what was learned, serving both as a learning experience for them and a means for learning more information for the people on the ground. And that's a very important aspect of the youth delegate program, that the information that is gained is not, there's not that sense of gatekeeping within the individual, but there's that spreading of information to make it as inclusive as possible, because these spaces, as we've mentioned, aren't accessible by everyone. And so that's why we really need sort of a revolution and to like obstruct and to destroy these systemic and structural barriers before we can continue discussing these topics. And so we mentioned opportunity finding, opportunity sharing, capacity building, awareness raising. These are all really important. And before we can actually go beyond GDP, we have to start at these really basic fundamentals and make sure that they're covered. And once we've covered all of that ground, move into the more technical matters. So for anybody who's listening online, to keep that sense of empowerment and recognize your own potential and ensure that any networking opportunities that you engage in do not remain at a superficial level, and that you really view people as humans and connect with them on a deeper and profound level. So thank you for having us, and thank you for these really fruitful and productive discussions.
Thank you so much. Any other final remarks from our panelists?
Just one last sentence.
Yeah, please.
I think it wasn't really mentioned. I think he pointed out a very good point about sense of belonging, like among the youth. I think I mentioned about having the privilege to be here and how to make sure that youth who are not here have also the same sense of belonging. I think the answer is quite simple, which is to share the opportunity that you have. By sharing information, we open like door or of opportunities to more youth. We also ensure that they feel engaged, that they can also be part of these movements. They can also be parts of these talks, that one day they can also have the chance to apply to be a delegate, to also be here and talk to the world. And I think that's one way how to make sure that we don't keep this experience to ourselves, but we open doors and we make sure that youth out there, they also have the sense of that they own this opportunity, that they own the space and platform to also speak to many people, to also speak for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I think that's
beautiful.
very beautiful words to finish. Thank you very much for
Mhm.
everyone here also.
Awesome. Okay, so speaking about what I take from all my panelists here, one thing that I would say the secret recipe or the secret sauce of activating these opportunities that I've seen so far is a youth exchange program. For example, in your region, I see a lot of successful story, YESS, Youth Exchange South to South. I've seen girls in my United community from Zimbabwe, for example. She wanted to do something, but there's no resources for her. But I can find her an opportunity to serve in Rwanda. And she can go to Rwanda and teach young girls about policy. And you do not know they are actually planting all these little seeds that yet to grow. And same goes to my very, very first opportunity being on the global stage was actually to go to Indonesia, a funded project from both the ministries of youth and sport, being in the Indonesia-Malaysia Youth Exchange Program. 10 years down the road, we do not know we're already building this path right here so that we have this moment right now. And I believe it's the same for all my panelists and all of you here. Looking back 5 years ago, 3 years ago, what are the steps that you actually celebrate or you actually allow yourself to take that makes you who you are today? So keep moving. I believe that even by showing up here, by showing your concern, your interest to topics like this, it's also a very big gesture. Not only us who are here, the people who make this possible, the crew that we have here, Joy who are actually here supporting us. I guess each and every one of us, we're playing a role to make this reality. So with that, I would also like to thank GPYD team from the Buddhist City Foundation for supporting my vision to have this being a reality so that we also have a very beautiful panel right now. And I hope that we can take this conversation further and let's not just stop here. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, my beautiful panelists. And also definitely thank you our friends online. And if let's say you have any other questions, you would like to engage, feel free to send me an email. Or for those who have my numbers, feel free to drop me a message. Thank you.